The British troops up on the summit were in a desperate situation. Artillery shells slammed into the hillside, rocking their defensive positions and slaughtering men in hastily dug trenches. Private and officer fell side by side, the chain of command severed as warfare on an industrial scale unfolded upon them. Amid the confusion and carnage, ammunition and vital provisions such as water and medical supplies ran low, and the British forces were essentially left to die in their dozens as an incessant artillery bombardment rained down. Finally, after 16 hours of pummeling on the hilltop, the British defenders withdrew. Somehow, the British had come within a hair's breadth of victory. Going against orders, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Thornycroft, who had been acting as commanding officer since Major General Edward Woodgate was mortally wounded by a shellburst, pulled his men out under the cover of darkness. With no communication from his superiors and with slow responses from reinforcement and resupply columns, Thornycroft likely felt he had no choice. 243 men lay dead and more than 1,200 were wounded or captured. This is a story that will feel grimly familiar to anyone with an interest in the First World War. Men left to face the mechanical fury of industrial warfare with little to no protection, divisions abandoned to their fate by their commanders at the rear, a chilling disregard for human life. This tale could have come from the Somme or Galicia in 1916, or from Gallipoli or Los in 1915. But in fact, it comes from none of these places. Instead, this slaughter occurred in January 1900 on the summit of Spuwenkop near Ladysmith, South Africa, as part of the Second Boer War. For many historians, the Second Boer War is the first truly modern conflict, a struggle in which the might of the Industrial Revolution changed the machinery of warfare forever, and in which military tactics struggled to adapt. It's this conflict, as well as its origins and its legacy, that we're examining today in the latest episode of Untangling Africa. The roots of the Boer War stretch back to the mid-17th century when the Dutch founded their first African settlement around what is now Cape Town. By the 1650s, sailors in the employ of the Verenigde Oostindische Company, VOC, or Dutch East Indies Company, were in desperate need of somewhere to rest, recuperate, and resupply on the long and arduous journey from Europe to India and the East. The settlement at Cape Town, founded in 1652, provided this, but the arrivals from Europe soon found themselves wanting more. From 1659 onwards, Dutch settlers waged war on local populations, taking control of the rich natural resources at the tip of southern Africa. But by the beginning of the 18th century, something was happening in Cape Town that would set the colony on its own unique path. A very different path that later European colonies would take. While indigenous populations found themselves subjugated by European businessmen and governors, the recently arrived white population was divided among rigid boundaries of class and land ownership. There was no chance of indigenous families owning land. Indeed, large numbers were enslaved following military engagements and capture. But lower class white colonists were also disenfranchised to some extent. Finding nothing for them in Cape Town, many of these white settlers decided to go it alone, leaving the colony and trekking it out into the remote portions of southern Africa as yet uncharted by European powers. The trekker movement had begun, and this would have enormous implications for the next 2 centuries of South Africa's colonial history. The trekkers were tough. They had to be. In the rugged terrain of South Africa, settlers who went it alone had to draw upon skill, cunning, and resilience to survive. They were brutal too. Commando groups formed around trekker communities, defending against attacks from indigenous populations or launching attacks themselves. Commandos killed the adults of groups they vanquished and enslaved their children. The class position of the trekkers meant that they weren't allowed to own land or slaves, but they did anyway, making their own laws and their own rules as they became increasingly distant from the colonial administrators on the Cape and wholly separated from Dutch power in Europe. Separate from Europe, maybe, but not immune to its politics. When war broke out between Britain and France in 1793, the Cape became strategically vital. It was the British that got there first, occupying the region in 1795 and kicking out the VOC. The colony changed hands again after the Treaty of Amiens in 1802, but fell under de facto French control after Napoleon annexed the Netherlands. By 1815, the British were in charge again. Now, the colony that had spoken Dutch for more than a century and a half spoke English and used the English pound for its currency. Mass immigration began in 1820, but the British were not as adept at utilizing the local landscape as the indigenous peoples or as the trekkers, and resource became scarce as the population grew. Large-scale wars were waged against local Xhosa groups, adding more territory to support the growing colony, but the British needed labor to harvest the resources they found here. The British had outlawed slavery in 1807, but economic necessity trumped morality in South Africa, and the colony kept importing slaves until 1828. The Dutch may have gone, but their descendants, the Afrikaner trekkers or the Boers, remained. By the 1830s, the Boer settlements were expanding too. Not interested in the abolition of slavery, and disgusted by the idea of Anglicization in southern Africa, the Boers founded the Transvaal Republic on the Vaal River and the Orange Free States on the Orange. The British would eventually recognize these republics but quickly regretted this decision. In the 1860s, enormous deposits of diamonds were found in South Africa as well as gold, then still the foundation for global commerce and currency. The Boers controlled these resources, and the British coveted them. Resource envy and the British annexation of a struggling Transvaal in 1877 brought tensions to a boil, but it was the Anglo-Zulu War in 1879 that would bring Southern Africa to the brink of explosion. On December 16, 1880, the situation erupted and the First Boer War began. The First Boer War lasted only 3 months but was a rude awakening for British forces. Hopelessly behind the times, British troops advanced in the stiff, regimented columns seen on European battlefields for centuries, decked out in all their shimmering redcoat finery. Uncomfortable in the blistering heat of a South African summer, the British were at an immediate disadvantage, while the tactics and equipment of their Boer opponents proved too much. Operating in guerrilla formations inherited from their trekker forebears and fighting in the khaki uniforms they used on their farms, the Boers presented a difficult enemy. After 3 months of fighting, more than 400 British troops lost their lives, including commanding officer Sir George Colley, who was shot through the forehead at the Battle of Majuba Hill. The British killed only 25 of the victorious Boers. The conflict led to modernization on both sides. The British, stung by their defeat, set about changing the organization and strategy of its armed forces. The Boers, keen to legitimize their position in South Africa, set about restructuring the economy and society of the South African Republic. Further gold discoveries in 1886 reignited British interest in the region, and they began to make demands on the SAR and its president, Paul Kruger. The SAR must grant more rights to foreign Uitlander workers, basically British workers, in her gold mines, essentially diluting Boer influence over the region and its resources. Kruger did make some attempt to defuse the tensions, but British officials wanted more from the SAR and began reinforcing their troops along the border. By October 9th, 1899, Kruger felt he was left with no choice but to issue an ultimatum, demanding immediate withdrawal of the British garrison. 2 days later, after Kruger received no satisfactory reply to his ultimatum, the Second Boer War began. Despite the build-up of British forces, things went well for the Boers in the early part of the war. They immediately opened up 2 fronts, pouring into Natal from the SAR and driving into the Northern Cape from the Orange Free State. Within 2 days, the Boers had Mafeking on the border of the SAR and the Cape Colony under siege. The mining town of Kimberley to the south would follow. By early November, the invasion force in Natal would surround Ladysmith too. But these early successes shouldn't have been too much of a surprise. The British already knew how the Afrikaner forces fought, the tactics they deployed. This was a tough enemy, one that knew the country and how to use it, one that would strike from rough ground, remaining hidden when it mattered, deploying expert marksmen to pick off enemy soldiers. In response, the British had also switched from bright red to khaki and olive drab. The Highland regiments in particular, famous for the kilts and sporrans that carried so much cultural significance for the men in these brigades, had changed completely, covering up their battle regalia with camouflaged aprons. But while strategic modernization had transformed the British Army in just shy of 2 decades, the colonial forces still found themselves struggling to adapt to the irregular warfare of the Boers. This was the sort of thing we'd see from the Yugoslavian partisans or the long-range special forces units in Burma and North Africa during World War II, or even in Vietnam against French and American colonial forces. And yet, this was still the 19th century. As the century drew to a close, the British Army would suffer her greatest series of defeats of the colonial era. In what came to be known as Black Week, the British were defeated first at Stromberg on December 11th, then at Magersfontein 4 days later, and again at Colenso on December 18th. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the British still had not lifted the sieges at Mafeking, Ladysmith, and Kimberley. The Boers' tactics were working. Towns and cities present a problem for guerrilla troops. These are important strategic targets and cannot be ignored. General Peter Cronje, for example, commanding the Boers' western forces, had good reasons for besieging Mafeking and Kimberley and remained a serious adversary for the British throughout the summer of 1899 to 1900. But at the same time, they are static targets, tying both attackers and defenders to a specific area of the map, making guerrilla actions difficult. This was the situation Cronje and his men found themselves in February 1900. When Field Marshal Lord Roberts arrived at Magersfontein 2 months after the British defeat there, Roberts had numbers and technology on his side. This time, the British forces achieved victory. Some 30,000 infantry, 7,500 cavalry, and 3,600 mounted infantry, including the largest mounted division ever to serve in the British Army, convened on Magersfontein. In a move that took Cronje by surprise, Roberts split his forces, sending his Highland divisions in a feint to the west while advancing deep into Boer-held Orange Free State territory, severing lines of communication and cutting off the Afrikaner troops who had not already fled. Cronje was defeated, beating a hasty retreat with his panicked men. They would have their last stand at Paardeberg, inflicting heavy casualties on the British troops that surrounded them before they surrendered. Kimberley was relieved. It would take another 3 months before a British force, comprising of a large number of South African volunteers from the siege of Kimberley, could break the siege at Mafeking. Field Marshal Roberts had taken over from General Redvers Buller on operations in the west, but Buller was still active. Now the second in command of the British forces in South Africa, Buller oversaw attempts to relieve Ladysmith in the east, and once again failed in his objectives. After snatching defeat from the jaws of victory in the bloody chaos of Spionkop and being pushed back by General Louis Botha at Valkrans, Buller had done nothing to rescue his ailing reputation after mishandling campaigns in the west. But then, at the Battle of Tugela Heights, close to the earlier Black Week defeat at Colenso, General Buller found the victory he so craved. After more than 2 weeks of heavy fighting, Buller's men dislodged the Boer defenders on the hilltops, driving the Afrikaners into a desperate retreat. The besieged defenders at Ladysmith witnessed this defeat, and 2 hours later, the British troops rode into Ladysmith to lift the siege. Buller took much of the glory, but at the expense of more than 2,000 of his men killed, wounded, or missing in the war of attrition waged across the slopes at Tugela. The British would press home their advantage in a big way. Before the end of February, the Orange Free State capital at Bloemfontein was in British hands. Johannesburg fell in May, with Pretoria following in June. Cronje had been captured and sent into exile on St. Helena, while Kruger somehow escaped, re-emerging into Europe in an unsuccessful attempt to drum up support for further action against the British. The bastions of Boer power in South Africa had been smashed. Engaging in warfare of a more symmetrical variety, the British had been successful, but at an enormous cost. Just like in the 18th century, as the trekkers made their way out from Cape Town, The Boers at the dawn of the 20th century could get along just fine without a centralized base of political power. From late 1900, the Boer forces, freed from the trappings of siege warfare and territorial defense, unleashed a brutal guerrilla campaign on the occupying British. Generals De Wet and Delarey led commando forces that hit British troops hard and then melted away into the surrounding countryside. Military installations and communications infrastructure became sitting ducks for the highly mobile, highly motivated Afrikaner divisions who outmaneuvered their cumbersome, numerically superior British adversaries in almost every engagement. Just like the Americans in Vietnam or the British in Northern Ireland decades later, colonial forces struggled even to lay a glove on their enemy. An unprecedented assault needed an unprecedented approach. The tangles of barbed wire that would become such a recognizable part of the slaughter on the Western Front in the next decade soon sprung up across South Africa, installed by Field Marshal Kitchener in an attempt to hobble the guerrillas. Along the railway lines, which were once arteries of the British advance and now an easy target for the Boers, blockhouses appeared, fortified structures designed to maintain control in a lawless land. The fortifications that would bristle across Europe in the run-up to the First World War had their blueprint. But this did not succeed in halting the guerrilla actions. Kitchener, who had taken over from Roberts as Commander-in-Chief of the British forces in November 1900, resorted to more extreme tactics. Kitchener's policy was one of scorched earth, as troops crossed the country, burning farms, arresting civilians, and eliminating the resupply routes of their guerrilla enemies. This tactic was at once both medieval and somehow modern. It wouldn't have seemed out of place during the advance of the Mongol armies across Central Asia in the late Middle Ages, and we've seen similar approaches in Vietnam, the Persian Gulf, in Libya and Syria, and most recently in Ukraine. Kitchener and his British troops could not kill everyone they encountered, but they could intern them. Concentration camps were built, and Boer women and children, some the families of Afrikaner resistance fighters, others not, were crowded into these edifices, left to battle disease and death in conditions that were nothing short of horrific. Eventually, the strong-arm tactics of the British succeeded in strangulating the Boer will to fight. The guerrillas were split between the Bitterreinders, or Bitterenders, eager to fight to the death, and the Hensoppers, or hands-uppers, who were ready to surrender and sometimes even collaborate with the British. The remaining Boer leaders, principally Louis Botha and Jan Smuts, the latter of whom had scored major successes during the guerrilla campaigns, reluctantly joined the ranks of the Hensoppers, and the Peace of Vereniging was signed in May 1902. Almost 3 years of war and 15 months of sustained guerrilla operations were finally at an end. The concentration camps of South Africa did not escape international attention. Humanitarian Emily Hobhouse visited these camps, reporting her findings in the Manchester Guardian and triggering outrage among some sections of British society. In November 1902, 6 months after the end of the war, Hobhouse published a letter from Mr. Borstlap, translated from Afrikaans. "My dwelling is wholly laid waste. My flocks and herds have been taken by British troops," the letter read. "I'm 62 years old with broken bodily health. My dear wife is lame on one side from a seizure. We must remain in camp because outside there is nothing for us to do on account of our age and loss." Concentration camps weren't the invention of the British in South Africa. They were used in 1862 against the indigenous Dakota peoples in the United States, and again several years later during the Civil War, in particular at the infamous Andersonville POW facility. But perhaps Kitchener's camps marked a turning point in the way that ordinary people viewed these insidious weapons of war. Hobhouse's writing drew significant attention to the treatment of civilians in combat zones, and she succeeded in raising funds to help the people of South Africa whose lives had been shattered by the conflict. Widespread usage of barbed wire, of trench networks, of automatic machine guns and artillery bombardments, the difficulties commanders faced as they tried to adapt their training and their experience to new and horrifying methods of war, these aspects of the Second Boer War would find their grim parallels in the conflict that tore across Europe and the world just over a decade later. Guerrilla actions, asymmetric conflict, the hit-and-run tactic for fighting a larger enemy. These too would rear their heads again as the new century unfolded, and continue to do so to this day. After the war, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State were absorbed into the British Empire, but this wouldn't last for long. By 1910, the South African Union was declared, with Louis Botha at its head. The trauma of the conflict shifted Britain's view of its colonial holdings in Africa, and the government in London found that an ally on Africa's southern tip would be more valuable than a couple of subject provinces. As World War I loomed, the British Army adopted some of the tactics learned from their former adversaries, and Jan Smuts would serve as general during the conflict. Britain would also cease its policy of isolationism. The days of gallivanting through Africa were over, and the experience of fighting the Boers had underlined just how vulnerable and isolated Britain could really be in Europe. Her newfound alliances would later find Britain embroiled in two of the largest conflicts the world has ever seen, but embracing international partnerships actually served Britain well throughout most of the 20th century. The Second Boer War cost almost 100,000 lives, around 34,000 of which were combatants. It's estimated that 26,000 women and children died in Kitchener's camps, starved of food and exposed to disease. In addition to this, modern historians believe between 13,000 and 20,000 black Africans perished in these camps, although their deaths were not recorded at the time. These black Africans are the forgotten victims of the Second Boer War. Promised reforms and enfranchisements for the local black population failed to materialize after the Peace of Vereniging, and indigenous Africans would continue to be sidelined until apartheid made segregation and white supremacism official policy in 1948. The Second Boer War marked a turning point in a number of ways, and for many is emblematic of the beginning of the 20th century. But the human and social costs of the conflict were truly staggering. But what do you think? Was this the first truly modern war? What are the biggest legacies of the conflict, and which ones are still felt to this day? Don't forget to let us know all that and more in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.